Today I'm going to talk about one of my favourite topics, which is how we understand and shape and regulate behaviour online. And I hope that this is something that is relevant to all of you as people, as citizens, as well as behavioural scientists. Can you hear me all right with the mic? That's all good. So I want to start, before I get stuck in, how many of you have got a smartphone on you, in your pocket, in your bag? Yeah, literally everyone. How many of you got an iPhone on you? Okay. Does one of you who has an iPhone want to be a brave volunteer and tell us what your screen time is so far today? Just swipe right on the home screen. Anybody? That would be impressive. Anybody else? 27 minutes, okay. Another, we'll get one more for a bit of variety. 12 minutes, okay. So it's 9:10. I think a lot of us had a late evening last night, and already we've spent 15 minutes, half an hour on our phones. And that's not unusual. So the average American today is spending about 4 hours a day on their smartphone, and that's just one of the screens that they're interacting with. And I want you to keep that in mind, because one of the core parts of what I want to talk about today is how our lives are becoming increasingly lived through digital spaces, whether they be our phones or websites or work platforms. A lot of our behaviour and decision-making is intermediated by these digital platforms. And that can be a really positive thing. It can really increase convenience. I had a briefing earlier this week from the Estonia Centre, which was incredibly impressive. And it's clear that actually in Estonia, having government services online has been a huge improvement to people's lives. So there's a lot of positives that come from this. But equally, it leaves us open to harm, deception and manipulation in online spaces. And that's particularly what I'm going to talk about today. And one of the other things that I want us to keep in mind as we're going through is that even though we're spending so much time online, actually, a lot of our collective knowledge about how we make decisions and how we behave in online spaces is held by private companies rather than by the academy or the public sector. And we are catching up, I think, but it is definitely the case that Meta knows more about how we make decisions on that platform than we do. And that poses a real challenge for government and policymakers and regulators who are trying to work out how to curb online harms. But it also poses a challenge for us as behavioural scientists as well. But I also think it's an area where behavioural science has a huge amount to offer, and it's a real opportunity for us as academics, as practitioners, as policymakers to really step into this space and think about how do we want to shape those digital environments where we increasingly spend our time, interact with our loved ones, do our work, do our shopping. What do we want that to look like, and how do we make that as safe an environment as possible? So that's what we're going to cover in the next hour. But first, before I dive into that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about BIT, because a lot of the studies I'm going to present today are BIT studies. So the Behavioural Insights Team was set up in 2010 inside British government, and it was set up really with a dual mission. So part of the mission was to apply a more realistic understanding of human behaviour to public policy. So an understanding of human behaviour that drew on decades of high-quality academic research that before then wasn't really coming into policy making in any meaningful way. But it was also, we also set out to bring a greater degree of empiricism to policy making as well, and were some of the pioneers in running robust randomised control trials and other experiments on all types of policy questions, from issues from tax compliance to health to education to criminal justice. And really, the team's changed a lot over the past 15 years, but that core mission has not changed at all. That is very much still what we're about today. And we do all of that through the lens of social impact and thinking about how do we use these tools to make a difference in the world, make a positive difference in the world. And as you can see, over the past 15 years, we've also grown a lot and worked a lot internationally, which is something we're really proud of. And today I'm going to present examples from around the world. So, in particular, I'm going to talk through a piece of work that we did back in 2019, actually, and I'm really thrilled that Dr. Lucy Martin is here because Lucy was working with us in the team at the time and she was instrumental in writing this paper, which was authored by David Halpin and I. And what we did in this paper, so it was around the time, if you cast your mind back to 2018, 2019, governments around the world were really grappling with the question of how to regulate online spaces, and particularly how to regulate online harms. So the British government was writing the policy papers that would then become the Online Safety Act. The European Commission was working through the Digital Services Act, and both were working on digital markets regulation as well, as were other governments around the world. And the hypothesis that we put forward in this paper is that firstly, we thought that actually a lot of these online harms were behavioural in nature. So from people being inattentive to online privacy notices and therefore not making decisions in line with their data privacy preferences, right through to the way that social norms were shaping the toxicity and incivility in online conversations. And the flip side of that is that we also felt that a lot of the solutions were behavioural in nature as well, and that this was an underexploited toolkit for policymakers when they were thinking about how to regulate online spaces. And so we put forward a framework in this paper that had 4 pillars. So firstly, ways that we could enhance traditional regulatory tools like disclosures using a behavioural toolkit. There was a whole section on choice architecture, and I think what is now bundled together and termed online choice architecture, but wasn't at the time. There was a section on how we enhance competition between platforms, particularly through radical transparency measures. And then there was a final section on non-market design and really how we leveraged a wider view of behavioural science to foster positive social norms and positive interactions in online spaces. And when we wrote this, as Lucy knows, it was all pretty speculative. Like, these were ideas. We were drawing on some research and some studies that had been done, but really very little had been done at that point. And in the 6 years that have passed since the paper was published, I'm really pleased to say that we have taken those ideas and we've tested them with more than a dozen partners around the world. And we've worked out which of those ideas have legs, which of them work, how do we scale them, and what do they mean for policymakers. And these are just some of the partners that we've tested these ideas with, and some of them are in the room. I know Amy Hume, who's here from Ofcom. I can't see Amy. There she is. Amy's been working on some of the experiments that we've done in partnership with Ofcom on online safety. So what I want to talk through is a couple of different areas and talk through some of the experiments we've done, what we've found, but also some of my reflections on the broader lessons on how we understand online behaviour, but also what's next and what are the big unanswered questions, which hopefully are questions that some of you may want to weigh in on in future research as well. So before I dive into those sections, I just want to spend a couple of minutes on why I'm talking about online behaviour and digital decision making, and really draw out how does it differ from behaviour and decisions offline. And if you can just close your eyes and think about a supermarket, like a physical supermarket. And supermarkets are pretty savvy choice architects, actually. And they've been deploying behavioural techniques for decades. So when you go into a physical supermarket, there is a path chosen for you of how you move through the supermarket, where products are placed, the pacing of how you get to the checkout. There might be some behavioural techniques at the checkout itself. You might be prompted to donate to a charity. You might be prompted different ways to pay, whether to buy a bag or not. But it's generally a pretty low-tech interaction. And then if you think about doing an online supermarket shop on your phone, it feels really different, right? So firstly, there's a lot more choice. So compared to, I don't know what the name of the local supermarkets are in Estonia, but compared to my local Sainsbury's, which is pretty sparsely stacked most of the time, it's hard to buy all of the components for a full meal in a local Sainsbury's. Whereas if you go to Sainsbury's online, you literally have tens of thousands of products to choose from, to search, to filter, to compare to one another in terms of star ratings, in terms of customer feedback, in terms of price. So much greater choice and convenience, which also does throw up some interesting issues in terms of information and choice overload and comparison friction as well for us as behavioural scientists. The other thing is that compared to the physical supermarket, every piece of that digital journey through your online supermarket app is deliberately designed and curated to prompt you to do a particular thing or make a particular choice. And as much as you can try and do that in a physical space, it's not really possible. Whereas online, every piece of it can be designed, every piece of it can be tailored, every piece of it can be changed, which means that it also opens up huge opportunities for industrial level experimentation of what happens if we vary this, what happens if we change this, what happens if we prompt in this way, in a way that's just not possible at that scale in a physical space. And that again opens up both opportunities, there's light and dark in all of this. It opens up opportunities for personalised nudges, for personalised recommendations, but it also, perhaps not so much in a supermarket, but in other spaces, also opens up opportunities for manipulation as well. And then as we kind of think about less the supermarket context, but more social media platforms in particular, compared to offline environments, we also get these really strong network effects, a market dominance of a few platforms, and also, I always like to put a question mark here, but there's not really a question mark in my mind, that there's also misaligned incentives between the platform and the user. Excuse me. And that means that actually where you have the platform with this enormous amount of data about their users, about our choices, about our behaviour, industrial level experimentation and misaligned incentives, that's where we open up the space for a lot of what we're going to talk about today in terms of online harms. So let's start with dark patterns. And this is a concept that I think will be familiar to many of you. But just as a bit of a refresher, so dark patterns are user interfaces that trick us into doing something that we didn't mean to do. As compared to sludge, they're very much intentional, malicious. They also cover a much broader range of design patterns than sludge does. It goes well beyond frictions. And I'm going to talk through a couple of things here. Firstly, how do we know where these are? How do we identify them, and how do we start to prioritise where to intervene as a policymaker? Because these exist, as we know, across all corners of the internet, and we've got to prioritise our time and our efforts as policymakers. So one of the things that is increasingly being used, a behavioural tool, is a behavioural risk audit. And this work really draws its inspiration from the work of Stuart Mills in the UK. And what I've got here is a behavioural risk audit that we ran for the UK Gambling Commission. And we have a multi-year lab with the UK Gambling Commission looking at gambling-related harm, particularly online gambling-related harm. And we've run a number of experiments looking at the choice architecture of gambling platforms and also experimenting with ways to improve outcomes for consumers on gambling platforms as well. And this is just a stylised version of a behavioural risk audit. But essentially what we're doing is a more sophisticated version of user journey mapping. So we're going in and we're looking in both an inductive and a deductive way at what are the dark patterns and choice architecture that is shaping people's behaviour on the platform. So you can see here, we're looking at that through the sign-up process, through placing a bet, through the gameplay, but also in what does it look like to try and close an account and withdraw money, and what kind of communications are you getting along the way. And, excuse me, sorry, I woke up with a bit of a cold this morning, so I'm just going to sip water as I go through. So this is some of the things that we found. So we did this for 10 online gambling sites in the UK. And what we found across those sites was that firstly, it took a lot longer to close an account than it did to open one. And I think this is really important because there's really no reason for this. Like, coming back to the misaligned incentives, if the technology exists to make the sign-up process as seamless and smooth as possible, there is no technical reason why it shouldn't be just as easy for you to withdraw your money and close the account. It took 3 more actions to set up a deposit limit, which is one of the responsible gambling tools, than to place a bet. And it was really hard to get your money out once it was in the site. So this is just an excerpt from the Gambling White Paper, which was published in 2022, which I think is a really nice encapsulation of the role that behavioural science can play in diagnosing some of these challenges in online markets. And certainly the UK government used these behavioural risk audits to prioritise actually where are the areas where we really need to focus our efforts in terms of reducing consumer-related harm. But beyond just identifying dark patterns, we've also looked at how do we understand the impact of them on consumer choices, and also what are some of the alternatives that we might propose instead. So this is a project that we ran in France. We ran it with the French Public Transformation Authority. And it was a project investigating the ways in which cookies and the way that cookies were presented to you on websites drove consumer choices about their data privacy. And all of you sitting here in Europe would have experienced cookie banners. They were part of the GDPR regulations. And what you would normally see on a website, or what's the most dominant design pattern, is the control, which this is in French, but you can either accept, you can refuse, or you can personalise on any website. And these are the options that you should be given. But then we also tested the impact of a dark pattern, which you can see here is making it look like accepting the cookies is the only option and the default option. Or another one that isn't quite as pronounced, so you still have the refusal there, but the acceptance is shaded in and shown as the default. And then we also tested this against what we called bright patterns. So again, in all of this, these tools can be used for ill, but they can also be used for good. And so we thought, what would it actually look like to turn this around and have something that's much more consumer-facing and is going to help people make those decisions? So you can see here, we flipped around the defaults, where the default is refusing the cookies. There's another one which shows the implications of the choice. So when you accept, it says that this means that your data is going to be traced. And then we also had one that was more pronounced with the traffic light. So it has an implicit recommendation that actually, if your concern is data privacy, you should refuse the cookie. And now we did some survey work. So we ran this experiment with about 4,000 adult internet users in France. And we did a survey with them before the experiment. And before the experiment, around a third of them said that they would never share their data in any circumstance, that was their very strong preference, no circumstance whatsoever. Now, you can guess what happened. It wasn't that. So this is the impact. You can see here our sample of almost 4,000 people. So what you're seeing here is the grey bars are the personalisation, so very minimal personalisation across any of the intervention arms. And then the rest is the rate at which people are refusing the cookies. And the control is just shaded a different colour, but that's also the refusal rate of the cookies. So what we see here is, firstly, the default and the dark pattern is incredibly effective. So only 4% of people are refusing cookies when they see that. Even in the control, you've got 17% of people refusing, even though 30% have said, more than 30% have said, that's absolutely what they do in every circumstance. And then you can also see a dramatic increase in the refusal rates across the bright patterns as well. And I think this is interesting because, like any good experiment, it leaves us with as many questions as answers, because I don't think it's straightforward that actually a 50%, almost 50% refusal rate is necessarily the right outcome or the best outcome from a consumer point of view. And I think actually what we might want to see is something that's more aligned with people's pre-stated preferences. So what you can see here is we're perhaps overshooting, but also potentially shaping people's preferences if they were weak. So we can come back to that in the discussion, because I think it's quite, this question of preference and online choice architecture, I think, is really fascinating. But the other thing that was interesting in this experiment is we had a staged experimental design. So people saw, amongst other things, they saw 2 versions of whichever banner they'd been randomised to see. And then the third version that they saw was the control. So what you can see here is the difference in refusal rates between the first banner that they saw and then the neutral control banner. And so what we're seeing here is that, firstly, the default, the dark pattern default, has a pretty strong survival effect, if you like. So even if you see a neutral banner after seeing 2 of those dark patterns, you're still more likely to refuse, you're still more likely to accept the cookies. But on the flip side, you also see the bright patterns have a pretty good survival rate as well. So what we're seeing here is that what you're seeing in the market is influencing your future decisions about data privacy and cookies, even if the banner you're seeing is changing over time. And I think that's quite good news for bright patterns, because it means that actually you don't need the whole market to look like that to think that actually you might have a positive impact across the market and across consumers. And then to draw that through to a slightly different context, as I mentioned earlier, we've had a fantastic collaboration with Ofcom, which is the UK's online safety and telecoms regulator. And together we've tested a range of different implementation aspects of the Online Safety Act. And this one in particular, so to do this, we built a social media platform which was designed to mimic a lot of the features of popular market-wide platforms, and also enable us to experiment in a way that had some external validity. It's obviously still an online experiment, but allows us to vary some of the same design features that we see in different settings. And one of the experiments we did in particular that I think is really interesting in terms of a broader reflection on online decision-making was looking at the question of, as part of the Online Safety Act, when people sign up to video sharing platforms, they're asked whether they would like to see reduced sensitive content. And the sensitive content are things like violence, pornography, self-explanatory in some ways. And we did an experiment looking at actually how consequential is it, how that choice is presented to consumers at that sign-up stage. And sorry, I don't have a slide with all of the intervention arms, but I'll just talk you through them. So we had a control that was the setup in the Act, which was just a very simple choice. We had one that made the information about sensitive content more salient. We had one that defaulted people into seeing all content. Then we had a forced micro tutorial, which took people through some of the key aspects of the decision about sensitive content. We had the same thing but skippable. And then we flipped the default around. And we actually did this a bit later because we were interested to see what it would look like, so that people were defaulted to see reduced content. And the thing I want you to take away from this is, again, we've got a lot of variation in preference here across the same fundamental, relatively straightforward choice of, do you want to see sensitive content in your feed or not? And also, you've got almost a 30 percentage point gap in the decision between the two defaults. And I think that's really interesting because I think initially when we started working through some of these issues, I guess the orthodoxy was that the right type of regulation would just match people's preferences and allow people to exercise their preferences. But I think what we're seeing here is actually people's preferences when it comes to this type of online decision are pretty unstable, and they're pretty malleable by the choice architecture. And they're also very sticky. So as you can see on the right-hand side, 9 out of 10 people stick to their initial choice, no matter how it's presented. So that makes that initial choice really, really consequential. So I'm going to wrap this section up there. But I guess those are the things that I really want you to take away, which is that this online choice architecture, it really matters. It really matters a lot for our decisions and our behaviour online. And I think to date, we haven't put enough effort into really understanding what are the different mechanisms that drive that, and how do we design that online choice architecture in a way that promotes safety and good consumer outcomes. And also that you don't need this to happen in every part of the market. I think it's okay to have it happen in some parts of the market. In terms of what we do next, so a theme I'm going to come back to is that for each of us sitting in the room, for anybody sitting anywhere around the world, it's actually really hard to work out who's good at this and who's really terrible at it. Like if you're thinking about, for example, which platforms your kids should sign up to, or where you should go and get your news, or which video sharing platform you want to use, it's really hard to know how they're faring on things like dark patterns and misinformation. And I think there's more that we can do to collect some of this data and then reflect it back to consumers to help us make a better choice of actually where we go. Similarly, I think there's opportunities for AI here. No matter how much we experiment and how beautiful we get the online choice architecture, for most people, these are pretty boring decisions, and they're ones that they're asked to make again and again and again every day. And I think it would be amazing if we could have some kind of avatar or plugin where we just make that decision once. Maybe we're prompted semi-regularly to re-examine it and update it. And that happens across platforms, and it's for somebody else to work out exactly how to do that. Right, let's move on to online fraud and scams. So I think this is also a really fascinating area, and one that policymakers and regulators are working on around the world. Fraud in almost every country is the fastest growing category of crime. last weekend in the Financial Times, they published an article that said that if online fraud was an economy, it would be the third largest economy in the world. So that's wild. It's absolutely a massive industry. And it also leverages behavioural science to great effect. Whether scammers know that that's exactly what they're doing or not, they intuitively use the types of techniques that we would use as academics, as policymakers, but they use them against us to try and scam us. And I won't go through the details of this, but we can talk in the questions about the types of techniques that are used. But I guess the deeper thing is that it's not about intelligence, and it's not even about how much you really know about scams and how they work. A lot of the techniques and tools used by fraudsters and scammers are really tapping into our cognitive vulnerabilities and leveraging them against us. So I think we need to think about this as a behavioural issue rather than an education issue. And these are two very good books on that. So what can we do about it, and how can we test it? How can we test it in a way that's ethical and useful and interesting? So firstly, another example from France. One of the things we can do is we can put ourselves in the shoes of a scammer. And this is a project that we ran in France a couple of years ago, and the driver for it was that almost 1 million people across France had been the victim of some kind of retail fraud in the previous 12 months. And so it was having a really serious economic impact in the country. And the government was really interested in what could they do about that and what were the tools that they could equip citizens with to avoid this type of fraud. So we set up shop as a fake coffee making business, which was quite fun actually. So we bought several thousand Facebook ads and we packed them full of dark patterns, the type that we were seeing in the market at the time. And we then put them live and tried to encourage people to buy this fake coffee maker. And about 2,500 people did click on the link and try to buy it. I should say absolutely no money was exchanged, and I can talk more about how we set it up in the questions if that's of interest. So when people bought the fake coffee maker, they then went into the next stage of the experiment. So 4 weeks later, firstly, when they bought the fake coffee maker, they either went into a control group, which just took them to a holding page where nothing happened, or they went to the first intervention arm where they were given classic government information about scams. They were told they'd been scammed. This was the information about how to avoid it in the future. And the second intervention arm was the same, but then it was also condensed into easy to digest and remember rules of thumb. So we did that, then we waited 4 weeks and we went back out to those 2,500 people and we scammed them again. And we tried to get them to buy fake record players. And again, no money changed hands. But what we were interested in was what were the rates of re-victimization amongst those 2,500 people, and therefore how effective did we think these interventions were at preventing fraud. And here's what we found. Unfortunately, because the group that then went on to buy the second product became quite small, as you can see, our results are not statistically significant, but there's a positive and encouraging directional effect here in terms of the efficacy of these interventions. So this was sort of, I would say, our sort of initial work on fraud and scams. And then really in the intervening years, the world changed again, and AI has made fraud much more sophisticated, much more prevalent, and able to be personalised at a much greater rate. And so the latest piece of work we've done on this is with the Ontario Securities Commission in Canada. And we ran, again, an online experiment with Canadian adults looking at retail investment fraud. And we wanted to understand, firstly, how effective was AI-enabled fraud, but also could we flip it around and could we use AI on the side of consumers and investors as well to help them avoid fraud and scams. And I'm going to talk you through the experimental setup because it's a relatively complex experiment. So people were given $10,000 to invest, and they were shown a social media feed which had irrelevant posts, but then also investment opportunities and advertisements in it. And as you can see here, we had 2 controls and 2 treatments, and they looked like this. So the first control was 3 legitimate investment opportunities that reflected what was available in the Canadian market. So we've got a legitimate ETF opportunity, a robo-advisor, and a cryptocurrency opportunity. And we did a lot of work to make sure that these were representative of the types of investments available in the market. And we then had a control which was looking at conventional fraud posts. So within that first control, you've got the legitimate posts and just the conventional fraud posts. So the conventional fraud was a fraudulent ETF opportunity. So some of this had hallmarks of non-AI fraud, so spelling mistakes, overclaiming, some telltales of what was happening, and that was across each of the opportunities. And then we had a second control, which was the AI-enabled fraud posts. So you can see here we had the ETF opportunity, but we ran it through ChatGPT to make it as legitimate as possible. We had an AI-enabled algorithmic investor, and we had an AI-generated video which was promoting a fraudulent cryptocurrency opportunity. And we then had 2 treatment arms. So firstly, we had an inoculation arm, which draws on the body of work, particularly spearheaded by Dr. Sander van der Linden at Cambridge University. So this is drawing on the idea that if you show people some of the techniques that are used by fraudsters before they see the fraudulent posts, so effectively if you give them a little dose of what this looks like, they're more able to spot it and be resilient to it when they see it in the wild, if you like. And then we had a web browser mock-up, which we called Scam Finder, which was essentially scanning all of the opportunities across the platform and giving them a RAG rating based on their scam risk. And this is what we found. So firstly, somewhat discouragingly, AI-enabled scams were much more effective. So that's discouraging, but actually what's more discouraging is that conventional scams are pretty effective still too. So you'll recall people had $10,000 to invest, and you can see here, more than 40% in both arms is being invested in fraudulent opportunities. So it comes back to our sort of opening remarks that this is not about intelligence. These are very sophisticated scams and frauds that are tapping into our cognitive biases. But this is what we saw on the treatments. So compared to the AI-enabled scam, we saw that both of the treatments did reduce the amount that was invested in fraudulent opportunities, and particularly the web browser mitigation was very promising. But again, you've still got 36% of that pot being invested in fraud. So I think the Ontario Securities Commission found this incredibly interesting, and it's given them food for thought about how they regulate this space, but also that actually these types of interventions on their own are not going to be enough, and much more muscular market interventions are going to be required to reduce the amount of fraud in retail investing. So just as a quick wrap up here, so there are behavioural evidence-based techniques for scam reductions that we have from BIT, but also from many others, good reason to think will work. But in terms of frontiers, I think what we're seeing is an increasing sophistication of AI-enabled scams. So we're going to have to become ever more savvy in this area, I think. But also, hopefully, we can use AI as a lab as well and build things like the web plugin that I showed in the Ontario Securities Commission example to be on the side of consumers. Oh, sorry, the file's not working. Right, I'm actually going to skip through mis and disinformation in the interest of time, but I'm happy to talk about it in the questions. And I want to finish with some reflections on online toxicity and abuse and also democratising decision-making. So firstly, online abuse. This again is an area that I feel really passionate about in terms of reducing online abuse. I gave evidence to the UK Parliament a couple of weeks ago about the security of members of Parliament and the rising levels of abuse against MPs, predominantly online. And particularly their concerns that amongst younger generations, there's a lot more tolerance and acceptance of that level of abuse levied at people in public life, but particularly MPs. And I think it's really distressing, number one, but particularly where it's levied against people in public life, it's really discouraging women and people from ethnic minority backgrounds to engage in public life. And I just think it's something that we as a society need to tackle. We need to raise the tone of our online conversations and be clear that it is not okay to abuse and intimidate people, whether it's in a physical space or online. It shouldn't matter where you are. But these are some of the behavioural drivers behind it. So particularly hot state decision-making, coupled with online disinhibition, people making very quick, rapid judgments about how to engage in, threads and conversations online. But also the evolving social norms of online spaces. And I do think potentially one of the drivers of younger people feeling like this kind of abuse is acceptable in some scenarios is that it is what gets rewarded in online spaces, in the attention economy. Things that provoke outrage are the things that get clicks, that get promoted in feeds. And therefore, I think it's easy to look at those feeds and think that this is the norm and that this is acceptable when it's really not. So what do we do about it? So this is an idea that we put forward in the 2019 paper, and actually we didn't test it ourselves, but a couple of other people did. So one of the ideas we had, particularly to break that hot state decision-making, drawing on other work we'd done on friction and positive friction, was to think about when you use natural language models to detect abusive or toxic or violent language online, if you could just prompt a moment of pause and reflection and ask people, is that really what you want to say? Do you want to, this particular one was done on Twitter before it became X, but as you can see here, the options that you have are to tweet, to edit, or to delete. And the idea was that this quite simple break that could potentially only take a second or two would just diffuse the situation and diffuse that hot state decision making. Now in 2020, Twitter tested a version of this, and I can't actually find much about the methodology of how they did this, but what they reported was that where people saw this prompt, more than a third of people revised their initial reply, which is huge. Right? That's a massive, in a dynamic market, dynamic system where people are responding to what's happening, they're responding to what's prevailing on the platform. Having a third of people edit their reply is really huge. And they also saw it led to lasting behaviour change. So after people had got this prompt once, they were actually much less likely, or moderately less likely, to post offensive replies in future as well. So happily, somebody did test it in a robust RCT. So researchers from Yale Law School took this intervention, and they ran an RCT across almost 500,000 tweets and 220,000 users. And they found similar directional effects, but not quite the same magnitude of impact, but I think still really interesting and still, an effect that's definitely worth getting out of bed for. So a decrease of 6.4% in offensive replies sent. So again, if you think about that in a dynamic system, that is starting to shift the tone and the nature of the conversation. And again, they also found that the impact was not just on the specific tweets, but also on the dynamic nature of the conversation and what people did afterwards. So obviously Twitter is no more and this feature doesn't exist on X, but I think it's something interesting to think about across lots of different platforms, and it has application beyond just social media as well. This is another study that was done by the Cornell University Citizens and Technology Lab. They ran an RCT on Reddit, on the subreddit for feminism, which is a space where there's some pretty appalling behaviour. And what they tested was telling newcomers that, yes, there are trolls on this subreddit. They're in the minority, and this is the type of thing they post, but actually this is not the norm on this feed. And what they saw was that, I think it was over a 3-month period, seeing that message actually increased the contributions of newcomers by about 20%. And in terms of what we do next, so thinking about parallel fields, one of the projects we're running at the moment is a replication inspired by Betsy Paluck's work in the US on the Roots program, which those of you familiar with it, it's an anti-bullying program being rolled out in US schools that Betsy tested. And what she did, I think, was really quite ingenious. So she went into those schools and identified what she called the social reference in the schools. So the students who were able to influence their peers. And it's not the popular kids, because the popular kids have actually a very stratified social network. And what she found is it's actually the kids who are sort of sitting in the middle of the social hierarchy who can bridge across different parts of the school who are able to influence their peers. So she identified those students and then worked with them to co-design anti-bullying interventions. They had pretty broad remit as to what those were to roll out in the school. And what she saw across 56 schools, almost 25,000 students, was about a 30% reduction in conflict after a year. And we're currently replicating this in UK schools. But I think the core idea of mapping social networks and leveraging them in this way is really interesting in this field of online abuse, but it's also really interesting in lots of other areas that we all work in as well. And we I think, often don't quite go far enough when we think about social networks and social norms. So I'm just going to finish with a few reflections on who decides all of this. So if you think back to us all getting our phones out and seeing how much time we spend on them, we're living our lives via devices, via digital platforms. It's shaping the nature of our relationships. It's shaping how we attend to things. It's shaping what we attend to. It's shaping how we work, every part of our lives. But who's making the rules of these platforms? It's not us, but it should be us. We should have a say in actually what is the nature of this ecosystem? What do these platforms look like? What are the rules of the game on social media? And one of the, I guess, more radical ideas that we put forward in the 2019 paper was to take the idea of deliberative democracy, and particularly citizens' assemblies, and apply them to the governance of particularly social media platforms, so that we could create a collective user voice in the governance of these platforms and deciding actually what do we want them to look like, what do we want their character to be. And we were very fortunate that at the time, public affairs at Meta was run by Nick Clegg, who was a previous UK Deputy Prime Minister. And Nick and his team read the paper and they said, great, let's try it. Yeah, let's give it a go. And at the time, Meta was already doing some really interesting things with their governance on the platform. So you might recall they had already set up the oversight board, which was very eminent scholars and politicians from around the world who were making deliberations on extremely high-level content moderation questions. So questions like, at the time, should Donald Trump have a Facebook account? So questions like that were going to the oversight board. So they were effectively acting as a judiciary. And then you had the board acting as an executive. And what we wanted to do was build the legislature. So how do you bring in the collective voice of the people who actually use Facebook, as it was at the time, then became Meta? How do we represent ourselves in these decisions? And so we ran a series of community forums on different questions before Meta about how they shaped the platform. So the first one, which was really a pilot, was on problematic content about climate change. So what they should do about information that was not quite disinformation. So it wasn't captured by regulation, but they felt it was problematic. What should they do about that as a platform? And we brought together people from across 5 countries to deliberate this in an online community forum. We wanted to do it in a way that was scalable, that was cost-effective, but that could also bridge different countries and cultures. And then we radically scaled that in the second and third ones. We partnered with the Stanford Deliberative Democracy Lab and used an AI-based platform to do asynchronous translation and moderation of these groups, which meant that we were able to bring in 32 countries and about 6,500 people across a weekend to debate what should be the rules of the game for bullying and harassment in the metaverse. So genuinely a question that users should have a view on and be able to shape with each other. And the last one we did was on AI chatbot interactions, and here's some of the questions. It was about really important questions like, should chatbots prioritise local perspectives or international ones in their responses? And I can chat through that more. So just to conclude, I think this is unfinished business. So as you can see, the last one that we did was winter 2023. Then unfortunately, the world has changed quite a lot since then. So this is still happening at Meta, but at a smaller scale, and I think in a more tactical way. Whereas I think there's real opportunity to think about how could we do this across platforms for issues that are not specific to certain platforms like AI, that really do make us in the room, make us around the world feel like, yeah, we have a stake in this and we also have a say in this, of what do we want our online world to look like, what is important to us, what kind of decisions do we want to be able to make, what do we want to be supported on. I think I'm going to stop there, actually. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that was a useful canter through some of the experimentation on online decision-making. Very happy to talk about any of those areas, and also very happy to talk about that intersection between robust research and policy-making as well. But this is my LinkedIn QR code if you'd like to connect. Otherwise, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Liz. Is this something that you've been working on? If we have a stake in it, we should have a say in it? Or is it like a...
Spontaneous, but I do believe it.
Wow. Thank you. Questions? We have 2 microphones. Yes, Pirjo. Kristel, past you.
Hello. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I'm actually also working on that, who makes the decisions.
Oh, great.
When they, all kinds of digital products are created, and what I have come to is also in one of my interviewee said that it used to be that you can't get to a conference to talk if you don't have the word sustainability.
Yes.
But now you can't get a conference talk when you don't have the AI.
Yes.
But perhaps we should combine them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my question or thought also, that the digital sustainability, and I'm not talking only about the environmental impact, although this is my interest, but as you also mentioned, the social side of it.
Yeah.
How the platforms can influence vulnerable groups differently, and also the digital literacy. So perhaps my question is, do you think that in the future this should be more regulated by policymakers, this area? Because I agree, we don't actually know where our data goes.
Yeah.
It does harm to the environment as well.
Mm.
And what is done with this data? There are so many other questions there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I think the core question there is, how should we regulate what data goes into AI models? Is that right? Or just the impact of AI models more generally, large language models?
Digital anyway, and any kind of digital, should we start regulating it more by policy?
Yeah, I see. I mean, I would say I think policymakers around the world are doing a really good job of adapting to a rapidly changing landscape, and also adapting the regulatory approach to fit that as well. So I think there's a lot of positive work happening in terms of experimentation, in terms of flexible principles-based regulation around the world. Yes, I do think there is much more to be done, and particularly a lot of those regulatory regimes are just they're in their infancy, and they're in the implementation phase, and I think there's a lot to be learned as well as we move into more of a supervision and enforcement phase. So for me, it feels like one of the most vibrant and consequential areas of behavioural science, because it does genuinely feel like we are at the start of this, and it's what's going to shape our lives for decades to come. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. There and then here.
Hi.
Hello.
I think this was really interesting.
Thank you.
I wanted to hear your perspectives on this conference in general, and we talk a lot about the interventions that can be done, how can we feed them into policy and improve regulation and all of this, but there's another side to this that is, a lot of times, at least in my perspective, we have a lot of the regulation.
Yeah.
There's a lot of rules that actually say, look, this is not legal. A lot of the dark patterns have never been legal.
Yeah.
So my question is really, is laws and legislation, is it enough? Because what if the problem is enforcement? What if we can never prove or who has the side of it? And I think we are getting maybe a little too little about, one thing about is how we regulate it. Another thing is how do we come after it? Or how do we it?
No, absolutely.
Enforcement.
Yeah.
I wanted to hear your perspectives on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I totally agree. And I think one of the areas that I think is quite promising is reputation regulation. And it's sort of in its relative infancy. And I should say these are all my personal opinions here. But if you think about some of the big platforms, fines are not particularly consequential to them. They're incredibly well-resourced companies. What is consequential is, can they hire top talent? Do people want to go and work there? Do people want to sign up for the platform? Do people want to stay on it? And so I think taking the work that's being done on enforcement, and particularly the diagnostic work of what's happening, and finding a way to reflect that back to consumers in a meaningful way, probably through popular media, to say, like, to try and target those reputational levers. I think that that's an underexplored area, and I don't know if it will work, but I think it's worth a try. I think it's worth a try, kind of more than has been happening around the world so far. So, yeah.
Thanks, Lucy here, and then Stefan at the back.
Thanks, Liz, for the super interesting talk. One of the things you said that I think is really going to stick with me is when we're trying to make behavioral policy about online environments, or even just generally behavioral policy, we might think ideally we try to match people's preferences, but in fact those preferences might be sort of ill-defined, vague. People might have never even thought about what they want in that specific context. So that means that both the default sort of privately determined environment, as well as any changed environment that we try to make happen, is something that has the potential to shape people's preferences. So it feels like an even bigger responsibility to design behaviorally informed regulation, in this context. So I suppose my question is, how do we do this responsibly? Have you sort of learned any lessons about approaching this? Is it as kind of simple as saying, well, there's policy goals and we just kind of pursue that? But often the policymakers don't quite know either. So yeah, what have you learned around this, and do you have any insights you can share with us?
So it's such an interesting area, and actually I feel like you and brilliant researchers like you should grasp this and and try and answer some of those questions. I mean, the short answer is, like, a lot of this I don't know. I don't know what the best way to try and investigate some of these preferences are, because I think what we've learned so far is fairly superficial in terms of people have stated preferences, they don't stick with them in the face of different online choice architecture. It would be wonderful to hear if there's studies that go further than that and deeper than that. But we haven't done anything that's gone that next level of actually, are people happy with those shifted preferences? To what extent are they consciously updating them? I think that's like very much in its infancy, but it feels to me like one of the core issues, and particularly when you go down the road of AI agents as well, because in that scenario, you probably don't get many shots at expressing your preferences up front before they're then acted on for you. So I think it's super interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. Stefan on the back.
Thank you, Elisabeth. That was a really fascinating talk. Stefan from Behavioural Insights Australia.
Hey, Stefan.
I'm a former environmental regulator, so I look at this and I think, isn't this a form of pollution in a way? What's going on? And in that space, if you interview past EPA CEOs and things like that, and there's some research on this, they felt like national pollutant inventories was one of the most successful interventions they ever did, which was simply requiring toxic emissions to be reported and acted, and then this empowers third-party actors to hold companies to account. So I found your thought about the league table of things to be really encouraging in that space, and the other experiments were really cool, but you look at it and you think this is essentially a game of cat and mouse between the companies or the fraudsters and the white hat actors, and some of them have a lot more resources and incentive to keep on going. So that sort of system-wide intervention seems much more attractive. So I guess my question to you is, in your conversations with policymakers and so on, what motivations and drivers and enablers have given them confidence to take these more strong interventions? And I guess I'm not talking strict bans here. Like in Australia, I think we're a couple of weeks into a ban of social media for people under 16, which is really fascinating to see how that rolls out. That's obviously a very blunt intervention. Where you've seen policymakers and regulators really make behaviourally informed regulatory decisions, what gives them confidence and enablers to do that?
Well, I mean, I think thank you, great reflections. I think something that's encouraging for everyone in this room is that I think a lot of it is genuinely evidence-driven, and there's a real desire to build the evidence base and understand, how do these mechanisms work, and therefore how would you intervene and how would you implement existing regulatory powers. I think though some of the mechanisms are not straightforward. Like, for example, the social media ban in Australia. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of that is that it's currently almost entirely unenforceable. But it doesn't really need to be at this point, because the power of it is that it's enabling collective action amongst parents and schools, and it gives a very clear set of guidelines of actually under 16, we think children shouldn't have access to social media. It gives a hook to parents and schools to organise themselves, to say, okay, we will make sure that actually within this friendship group, within this grade, within this school, that's what's happening. And so I think we need to be alive to those different routes as well, of like, it doesn't all need to be sort of black letter law. It can be much more fluid than that as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Antero.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. That's another example of me being really inspired by your work. And my question is also taking a different route, going to the kind of the methods that you're using. So in my experience, you could say that you could either do well-designed experiments that are really informative. The different arms are designed based on theory and will tell you stuff. Or you can do field experiments. Somehow you manage to do both. And then my question is that, given based on your extensive experience, what are the recommendations to get there? Do you have like an accumulated set of tips and tricks how to? And I guess what is most crucial there is how to kind of convince the partners or build the relationships with the partners in the field that seem to be really instrumental to get these really well-informed, well-designed field experiments.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. I mean, many of us in the room will know that running field trials is incredibly exciting and rewarding, but also quite challenging. And there's lots of things that can surprise you when you're implementing a field trial. I mean, in lots of areas we do aspire to get to a field trial because we want to be demonstrating real world impact, and it is still the most compelling thing to go to a minister or a policymaker and say, this is what's happened here with real people in real scenarios, and like, we're really confident about this. However, I do think over particularly the past 6 years, we've done a lot more online experiments. And I think it has been incredibly beneficial to have the two alongside one another, because the online experiments let us get a lot deeper into the mechanisms. They're also often the pragmatic choice, particularly where we're experimenting in areas where we can do a pretty good simulation of a real-world environment. It's obviously a lot more challenging in other policy settings. So I think in this sphere, a well-designed online experiment is, it's not a second choice. Like, I think it is a really good option in a lot of scenarios. I guess the other thing I would say is that you don't necessarily need the cooperation of all the partners. And, if you look at, for example, the French fraud experiment that we did on Facebook, that didn't require the cooperation of Facebook. Like, we complied with all of the terms of service of Facebook. Yes, we did. We bought we bought the ads legitimately, and we didn't take anybody's money. But we didn't go to them and say, can you randomise this across the platform? So I think there's still a lot that can be done sort of in the field, but not necessarily needing a lot of partners involved. And actually, I guess another really nice example of that, one of my favourite experiments, it's probably quite a few years old now, but Hunt Alcott did a study on the well-being effects of Facebook, and he paid a random selection of people to deactivate Facebook for 4 weeks, and then compared them to a control group and measured lots of different areas of subjective well-being, as well as things like their objective understanding of the news, their levels of polarisation. And again, it was very much speaking directly to the impact of Facebook and what was happening in the field, but without the direct cooperation. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Rob.
A question about methodology again. I mean, what you've presented are clearly high quality, rigorous methods, but they're generally quantitative. And perhaps you can get deeper in, as you were mentioning before, you'd like to get deeper into some of the decisions people are making.
Yeah.
Well, qualitative methods and process. There's a whole traditional and some interesting new methods to do that. I just wonder what the role of that kind of method is in the work you're doing at the moment and what you might do in the future.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. Thanks, Rob. And I should say, actually, maybe a bias that I have presenting in forums like this is perhaps overweighting the quantitative work versus the qualitative, because in almost all of these projects, we've had a strong qualitative component as well, and particularly actually in the meta work on community forums, we did a lot of really deep analysis of the discussions in those community forums. We did a lot of pre and post surveys to look at people's attitudes on different metrics. So it's definitely something we do, and I think when I talk to any aspiring behavioural practitioner, I certainly say don't forget the qual work. Like, don't diminish it or think it's secondary, because actually, a well-designed RCT or experiment tells you many, many things, but it tells you so much more if it's paired with good qual work. And particularly in areas like this where the quantitative results, they do leave us with unanswered questions and head scratches. So, yeah.
Thank you. And last question from Leo.
Thanks a lot, Liz. Super great talk. I really enjoyed that.
Thanks, Leo.
In the spirit of better understanding how behavioral interventions feed into the overall system, I was wondering whether you look at negative side effects potentially. In the cookie example, for example, if you were super successful and nobody accepts any cookies anymore, there is no ad revenue anymore, and there need to be other ways. Either the websites go away, or we have to pay immediately to. So we have to think a little bit about the secondary effects of the interventions. Do you have a systematic way of doing that in the spirit of the manifestos that somebody wrote and so on?
Yes.
Is there a way of looking into the system effects of individual interventions?
Yeah, definitely. So, and you're right, in the manifesto we do talk about seeing the system and how we can do that better. We haven't got examples in this field, but it is, I've skipped past it, but one of the frontiers I wanted to talk about was running experiments on dynamic platforms, because you're absolutely right. A lot of the empirical work in this space intervenes at a point in time, but we know that there's multiple actors. We know, for example, that content creators update their behaviour, that the platform updates their behaviour, that consumers become desensitised to certain types of interventions over time. And there is currently very little work about how that plays out, what it means for the effectiveness and the impact of an intervention over time. I would love to do more on that, particularly in these areas, because these are all areas where there's multiple actors with multiple incentives coming together. So yeah, look, if anyone would like to do that, I'm absolutely open to it, and it would be fantastic. And I think we should all aspire where we're experimenting in this space to try and do something that's, over the long term and taking into account those dynamic impacts. So great question. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Liz.
Thanks, Heidi.
A round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you.